The glass didn't shatter dramatically. It simply tipped over the edge of the dessert table and landed on the marble floor with a flat, hollow sound. The kind of sound that a room full of people should have heard but chose to ignore. That was the moment Zara realized something she had been refusing to admit for 9 years. Nobody at the Harrington estate that evening was going to do anything. Not the retired appellate judge sitting at the far end of the main table. Not the 3 city council members who had arrived together in a black SUV and shaken everyone's hand warmly at the door. Not the women in their cream-colored gowns who had spent the cocktail hour discussing their foundation work and their commitments to equity and inclusion. Not one of them was going to move. They would all continue holding their crystal glasses and their polite expressions and their safe, practiced silence. Zara Harrington, née Zara Okonkwo, from the east side of Columbus, Ohio, the third of 5 children of a woman who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility, and a father who left when Zara was 11, stood at the edge of the terrace in a navy gown she had bought 2 weeks ago and altered once. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised even her, that the silence in that room was not new. It had always been there. She had simply been too determined to love her way through it. The estate sat on 40 acres outside of Charleston, South Carolina. The Harrington family had owned it in one form or another since the 1940s, and they moved through it with the ease of people who had never had to consider whether they belonged somewhere. The terrace, where Zara was standing, overlooked a garden that was maintained by a crew of 4 people who came every Thursday. Beyond the garden was a small lake, and beyond the lake were trees so old and thick they looked painted onto the evening sky. Zara had stood in this exact spot every year at the Harrington summer gathering. Every year she had watched the sun lower itself behind those trees and thought, "This is beautiful." Every year she had told herself that beauty was enough, that love was enough, that the looks and the pauses and the small, precise cruelties delivered with the smiles of people who had been trained since childhood to keep their faces pleasant, that all of it was manageable, survivable, a reasonable price to pay for a life shared with the man she had married. His name was Dawson Harrington. He was 44 years old. He was handsome in the way that men who have never worried about money are sometimes handsome. A kind of careless, well-maintained ease. He played tennis on Sunday mornings. He had gone to Vanderbilt for undergrad and Duke for law school, and had spent the first decade of his career at a firm where 3 of the senior partners had gone to school with his father. He had a voice that carried in rooms without him having to raise it, and he used it the way he used most things. Without much thought, and with the assumption that the world would arrange itself around whatever he said next. Zara had met him at a conference in Chicago 8 years before they married. She had been 31. She had already built 2 companies by then. The first, a logistics software firm, she sold at 28. The second, a supply chain analytics company that was, at the time of the conference, 14 months old and growing in a direction that made investors drive to her rather than the other way around. She had been in Chicago to speak on a panel. Dawson had been in the audience. He had found her afterward near the hotel bar and said something that surprised her. Not a compliment about her presentation, not a question about the business, but a simple, direct question about what she was reading. She had a book folded under her arm, a worn paperback she carried everywhere. He asked about it. She told him. They talked for 2 hours. She fell in love with the man who asked about the book. She spent the next 9 years slowly understanding that that man and the man he became inside his family were not entirely the same person. The Harrington family had welcomed her. The way a house welcomes a draft. You could feel it, the subtle shift in temperature, but no one would name it. His mother, Marguerite, was a woman of remarkable composure who managed to make every interaction with Zara feel like a slight without ever saying anything that could be quoted back to her. At their first meeting, at a dinner in Charleston, Marguerite had held Zara's hand briefly and said she was so glad Dawson had found someone who worked hard. The pause before worked was small, almost imperceptible. Zara heard it. There were other things. At the family Christmas gathering, 3 months after they became engaged, Zara had been asked by one of Dawson's cousins, a man named Brent, who worked in private equity, and laughed at his own jokes, if she was there with the catering staff. He said it cheerfully, with a drink in his hand, and when Zara told him she was marrying Dawson, Brent had laughed even more cheerfully and said he was just joking. Lighten up. Dawson, standing 4 feet away, had heard the whole thing. He patted Brent on the shoulder later and said something low that Zara couldn't hear. And Brent had glanced at her and nodded. And Dawson came back to her and said he'd handled it. She had asked what he said. He told her not to worry about it. She should have paid more attention to that answer. The comments about her hair began in the second year of their marriage. They came primarily from Marguerite, always delivered as concern. She asked once, at a family lunch, whether Zara had considered doing something different with her hair for the holidays. Something more polished, she said, more appropriate for the occasion. Zara had been wearing her hair in a style she'd worn since college, a style that was as much a part of her as her voice. She smiled and changed the subject. She went home that evening and sat in the kitchen for a long time and did not cry, because she had learned a long time ago, in a small house in Columbus, that crying about things you could not immediately fix was a luxury you had to earn. By the 5th year, she had learned the exact geography of her exclusion. She knew which conversations would pause when she entered a room and resume after she left. She knew which gatherings she was included in on the mailing list and which she only heard about afterward through Dawson. She knew that his sister, Vivian, would hug her at the beginning of every event and spend the rest of the evening with her back turned. She knew that his brother, Reed, thought the entire marriage was a performance of some kind. A phase Dawson was going through, a thing that would eventually be corrected. She knew all of this. She stayed anyway. She told herself it was because she loved Dawson. And she did love him. Or at least, she loved the version of him that showed up in their home in Atlanta on ordinary Tuesday evenings when there was no one watching. The man who brought her coffee without being asked and remembered that she took it with 2 sugars and a splash of oat milk. The man who listened when she talked about her company, now her third, a firm called Okonkwo Systems that had grown into something she hadn't entirely anticipated, and asked intelligent follow-up questions and seemed to mean them. That man existed. She was sure of it. She had chosen to believe he was the real one. But belief is not the same as truth. And 9 years is a long time to hold a belief against mounting evidence. The summer gathering this year was the largest she could remember. 81 guests, according to the count she'd heard from the event planner Marguerite had hired. The estate was filled with people who had known the Harrington name their whole lives. Old Charleston families, law school classmates, business partners, 3 men who had served in the state legislature at various points, a woman named Patricia Greer who sat on the federal bench and who had arrived with her husband and a bottle of very good wine. There was a governor, or a former governor. Zara was never entirely sure because no one had introduced her to him directly. Zara had dressed carefully. She always did at these events, not because she cared what the Harrington family thought of her appearance, but because she had learned early that looking impeccable was a form of armor. She wore the navy gown. Her hair was exactly as she wanted it. She wore the earrings her mother had given her on the day Okonkwo Systems closed its Series B, a pair of small gold drops that caught the light quietly. She had looked at herself in the mirror before they left Atlanta and thought, "Whoever you are tonight, you will not shrink." She had meant it. She always meant it. It got harder every year. The first 2 hours of the gathering passed the way they always did. She moved through rooms. She made conversation with people who were politely indifferent to her. She ate a small plate of food at the corner of the terrace and watched a group of Dawson's cousins playing lawn games at the far end of the garden, and wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to be unremarkable. To walk into a room and have no one calculate your presence. To just exist. Dawson had been attentive at first. He stayed near her through cocktails and moved with her through the initial introductions. But sometime around the second hour, he drifted. He was pulled into a conversation near the library door by his father, and then by his brother Reed, and then by Brent from private equity, who was louder and redder this year than last. And by the time the seated dinner began, Dawson was at a table across the room with his back to her. Zara sat between a woman she didn't know and an empty chair that was filled, eventually, by a man who introduced himself briefly, forgot her name within 2 minutes, and spent the rest of the meal talking across her to the person on her other side. She ate her dinner. She watched the candles on the centerpiece burn. She listened to the sound of 81 people in a room talking about things that did not include her. The dessert table was set up near the terrace doors at 8 o'clock. People moved toward it in small clusters. Zara stood and moved with them, not because she particularly wanted dessert, but because remaining seated alone seemed like a statement she wasn't ready to make. It was while she was standing near the table, holding a small plate with a slice of something she hadn't tasted yet, that Reed came to stand beside her. Dawson's brother was 3 years older than Dawson, and he had their father's height and their mother's eyes, and a way of holding his body that communicated very clearly that he believed the space he occupied was his by right. He didn't say hello. He picked up a fork from the table and examined it briefly, as though checking for defects, and then he said, without looking at her, "You've got to be exhausted. Coming to these things every year." Zara looked at him. "I manage," she said. "I'm sure you do." He put the fork down. He finally looked at her, and his expression was the one she had seen from him for 9 years. Not hostile, exactly. More like someone observing a minor inconvenience they have learned to tolerate. "Dawson always said you were resilient. It's one of those things, isn't it? The people who come from nothing tend to be. The people who come from nothing." She heard it the way you hear a sound before you consciously process what made it. The meaning arrived a half-second after the words, and in that half-second, she looked around the terrace and saw the woman in the champagne dress who had definitely heard, looking down at her plate. She saw the man in the dark blazer who had turned slightly away. She saw Marguerite, 15 feet to her left, whose eyes met hers for just a moment before dropping to her glass. Nobody moved. She turned back to Reed. She thought of a great many things to say. She discarded each of them. And then Dawson was there. She hadn't seen him cross the room, and he was standing between them with the particular energy he had in moments when he wanted a situation to resolve itself quietly. "Reed," he said. "We were just talking," Reed said. "I know." Dawson looked at Zara then, and she saw something in his face that she recognized. Not remorse, not protection. Something smaller than either of those things. A kind of discomfort with a situation he had created by choosing, over and over, to let it continue. She looked at her husband. She thought about the book he had asked about, at the hotel bar in Chicago. She thought about the coffee with 2 sugars and oat milk. She thought about 9 years of choosing to come to this estate, and stand in this family, and hold herself together in rooms that would have preferred she wasn't in them. "Don't," she said. He didn't understand what she meant. Or he did and chose not to. He reached out and put his hand on her arm the way you hold something down rather than hold something up. And he said quietly, "Can you just not make this into something tonight? For me. Please." She looked at his hand on her arm. The glass tipped off the edge of the dessert table and broke on the marble floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. "I'm going to step outside," she said. She walked across the terrace, past the woman in the champagne dress, past the man in the dark blazer, past the former governor, or whoever he was, past Marguerite and her glass of white wine and her careful, composed expression, and she went down the stone steps into the garden and kept walking until she reached the edge of the property, near the old wooden fence that bordered the garden's far end, where the light from the estate barely reached. She stood there. The garden smelled like night-blooming jasmine and cut grass. The sounds of the gathering, the voices, the music, the particular din of 81 people performing ease, drifted out from the terrace and dissipated somewhere above her. She thought about her mother. Eunice Okonkwo, who had worked double shifts for 17 years, and never once described herself as resilient, because resilience to her was just Tuesday. Who had driven Zara to the library every Saturday morning in a car with a broken heater until Zara was old enough to take the bus herself. Who had said, the day Zara called her from Chicago to say she'd met someone, that she hoped he was the kind of man who looked at her and saw everything, not just the things he found convenient. She had wanted so badly to tell her mother. Yes, he is exactly that. She was still standing there, near the fence, when she heard the sound of shoes on the stone path behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew it wasn't Dawson's. Dawson would give her time to compose herself and then come find her when the risk of a scene had passed. This was their pattern. This had always been their pattern. It was the woman in the champagne dress. Her name, it turned out, was Sandra, one of Dawson's father's colleagues. A woman Zara had spoken to briefly at 2 previous gatherings, and not retained because there were too many people at these gatherings to retain. Sandra stopped a respectful distance away and looked out at the garden. I saw that, Sandra said. Zara said nothing. I didn't say anything. I know that. I'm not going to pretend it was because I didn't know what to do. I knew exactly what to do. I just didn't do it. Sandra turned and looked at Zara directly. I'm sorry. Zara looked at her for a moment. Okay, she said. Sandra nodded. She seemed to want to say something else, and then she seemed to decide against it, and she walked back up the path toward the estate. Zara stayed in the garden for another 20 minutes. She was composing something in her head. Not a speech, not an argument. Something quieter, a decision about the shape of the rest of her life. She was still composing it when she heard a different sound from the terrace. Not conversation, something else. The specific quiet of a room full of people who have stopped talking because something on a screen has caught their attention. She walked back up the path. Through the terrace doors she could see it. Someone had turned on the large television mounted near the library entrance. She had never understood why a television was mounted near a library entrance. It was one of those Harrington details that seemed to exist without explanation, and the screen was showing a live broadcast. A news network, the one her firm had signed a content partnership with 6 weeks ago. An arrangement that had been covered in 3 business publications and 2 general interest profiles, and had, by any reasonable accounting, been in the public record long enough for anyone who paid attention to these things to have seen it. The graphic on the screen said, Live. Below it, a banner was running. Okonkwo Systems CEO Namta President's Advisory Board on Technology and Innovation. The anchor speaking on the screen was not Zara, but behind the anchor, filling the full frame of a graphic that took up the right half of the screen, was Zara's photograph. Her name. Her title. The name of her company, which she had named after herself, after the name her father had given her, and then left behind, the name she had carried, and built into something that now appeared on the screens of a lot of important people's devices on a regular basis. She stood at the terrace doors and watched the room. Marguerite had her hand pressed to her collarbone. The man in the dark blazer had turned fully toward the screen. The woman who had asked Zara about her dessert selection earlier and then drifted away mid-conversation was standing very still. Brent from private equity had put his drink down. Reed was standing near the dessert table. He had gone slightly pale in the way that people go pale when they are trying to process new information against information they have already arranged neatly in their minds. His jaw had not dropped. He was too controlled for that. But there was a visible recalculation happening behind his eyes, and it was not a comfortable one. Dawson was looking at the screen, and then at the door, and then at the screen again. When he finally saw Zara standing at the terrace entrance, something crossed his face. Not pride, not exactly. Something between pride and a long overdue reckoning. The expression of a man who has known the value of something for years, without ever acting like it. Patricia Greer, the federal judge, set her glass down on the nearest surface. She walked across the room. She walked directly toward the terrace doors. She extended her hand. Zara Okonkwo, she said. Just the name. Said the way you say a name when you actually know it. Zara shook her hand. I've been following your company for 2 years, the judge said. We should have been properly introduced tonight. That's my fault. I'm Patricia. I know who you are, Zara said. Good. Patricia glanced back at the room behind her, briefly, and then looked at Zara again. There was no performance in her expression, just a woman acknowledging a situation that had unfolded poorly and choosing finally to stand in it correctly. I heard what was said to you earlier. I should have said something then. Zara looked at her. Yes, she said. You should have. Patricia nodded once. She didn't flinch. Fair. The room had partially oriented itself toward the terrace doors. The gathering that had spent 2 hours arranging itself around Zara's absence was now arranging itself around her presence. And the adjustment was visible in the particular way that people who are accustomed to composure try very hard to maintain it when caught in an uncomfortable truth. She was not going to make a speech. That had never been her intention. She was not angry in the way that required an audience. She was something quieter than anger, a woman who had spent 9 years being precise and careful and patient, and who had finally, at the edge of a garden in the dark, completed a decision that had been building since the first time she sat in that house and felt the temperature shift. She crossed the terrace and found Dawson. He was standing near the window. He had his hands in his pockets, which he did when he was uncertain. She had always known that about him. She knew a great many things about him. She knew the coffee order and the tennis schedule and the low voice he used on the phone with clients and the exact quality of silence he produced when he had done something he didn't want to name. She knew him, and she was finished pretending that knowing someone was the same as being safe with them. I'm leaving tonight, she said. Not the party. The marriage. He looked at her. Zara, I've made the decision, she said. I wanted to tell you myself. I didn't want you to come home to an empty house and not understand why. He said her name again. He said a number of other things. She listened to them the way you listen to an argument you have already heard and already answered in your own mind. And when he finished, she told him she would have someone reach out to begin the process. And she asked the estate's front desk to call her a car, and she went to retrieve the small bag she had brought from Atlanta and had never fully unpacked. She was outside, waiting under the entrance portico for the car, when Sandra appeared in the doorway behind her. Where are you going? Sandra asked. Charleston first, Zara said. Then I'll figure out the rest. Sandra was quiet for a moment. That was what you just did in there, what you've been doing all night without even trying. That took something. Zara thought about it. No, she said finally. What it took was 9 years. Tonight was just the part where I stopped. The car arrived. It was a black sedan, clean, with the windows up against the humid summer air. Zara put her bag in the back and got in, and the car moved down the long gravel drive toward the gate, and through the rear window, the lights of the Harrington estate grew smaller, and then disappeared behind the tree line. She pulled out her phone. There were 11 notifications, calls from her communications team, a message from her COO, 2 texts from board members who had seen the broadcast. She would answer all of them. She would handle the advisory board appointment and the press inquiries and the follow-up interviews. And she would hire an attorney and begin the process of disentangling her life from a family that had spent 9 years treating her like a guest in a house where she should have been an equal. She would do all of those things. She had built companies from nothing. She knew how to begin again. She put the phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out the window at the dark road and the dark trees and the occasional light from a house set back from the highway. And she thought about her mother, who had worked double shifts and driven a car with a broken heater, and said, I hope he sees everything. She thought about what she would say when she called her. Not tonight. Tonight she just needed the road and the quiet, and the particular feeling of a decision that had finally caught up to the person she had always been. Outside, the South Carolina night moved past the window in long dark shapes, and Zara Okonkwo, CEO, founder, daughter woman who had carried her own name until it meant something, leaned her head back against the seat and let it.